Yeah.
Well, what's the deal then if you can't remember where you were? And what does transform you?
You come down, you may not be able to say where you were, but you come down absolutely convinced that you've passed through some kind of cleansing fire. There's no doubt that the dross of some aspect of you has been burned away. And it isn't, you see, you come down in a series of declensions. 20 minutes after it, you may not be able to say very much, but 5 minutes after it, you'll be thrashing pretty hard to try and say something. It's just that it becomes more and more absurd, almost literally before your eyes. It goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. I mean, you go from having the message, which if you could but deliver it, would lead all mankind to glory, to forget it. Over here.
The primitive cultures in the Amazon you were with, did they ever take ayahuasca as a group? And you mentioned before that a person, when they do it solely, has a song. Did they ever do it in a group where a group had a song? And I'm wondering what that might be.
Yes, they did. There were songs that are culturally sanctioned Icaros as well, that everybody knows, and then people develop their own Icaros off of that. So, yeah, the people we were with, we would get together in groups of about 30, and I would say a third of the people would be there with a physical complaint of some sort, in other words, to be cured. A third would be there to learn, meaning to trip for tripping's sake. And a third would be there because it was the most interesting thing going on in the neighborhood, and they would just hang out.
Would that be quite an experience of kind of like undeniable unity you all would experience at that time?
We took it pretty much for granted, but considering how much trepidation I would have if I were to take ayahuasca with 30 of you chosen at random, we thought nothing of it, you know, and we were a pretty tight group. The shaman insisted that Kat and I move in with the village, that we were not to come and go from the little town nearby. And so we were part of things 24 hours a day for 5 weeks. And I love ayahuasca people. I think Ayahuascaros are unique people. They have a quality. You can hear it in their voice, actually, that they have attained some kind of authentic status of being that the rest of us are striving toward. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about if you identify a difference between curing and healing. The people who were coming for cure were coming for physical cure, presumably. And healing you may have even while you're physically dying.
True.
I'm just trying to sort of see what you meant by cure.
Well, these categories are not so rigid in the Amazon. For instance, a lot of what they think of as physical problems, we would think of as psychological problems. For instance, a big problem that a lot of Peruvians have is a disease called susto. But only Peruvians get susto. And what it is it's basically bad luck. You know, it's when things go wrong and won't go right, and then people will say, "Oh, you have susto. You better do something about this." And so there's a lot of curing of that kind of a condition, and then there's a lot of like what I would call fairly insightful minor psychotherapeutic intervention. I mean, I remember one woman, fascinating woman. This woman was beautiful. And she was from way in the woods, and she had this amazing voice. And her complaint was an ulcer. And she told the story of this ulcer in the meeting, in this amazing liquid voice in the darkness. And after she was finished, Don Fidel just sat, and then he said, "You're having an affair, and you're concerned what will happen when your husband finds out about this. And this is the cause of this pain in your stomach. And she agreed instantly that this was the cause of the pain in her stomach and that she had known it. And, well, now, I don't claim that as an instance of telepathy. I don't think that's what it was. I think it was a very skilled practitioner with a sense of this woman's sexual intensity, the nature of the society. He just put it together and figured it out, in a stroke of brilliance. But then she abreacted and went the next several days later. She was obviously in much better shape. It's, behind disease lies language. If you have a material model of disease, then language will not appear to be part of the issue to you. But spending time with these people in the Amazon, everything is about language in a society where magic rules, because magic is the domain of human concern in which language is empowered, in which will becomes a force that can strike you dead, So in these societies where magic is happening, language becomes everything, and you can cure somebody by simply telling them that you're going to, and then acting as though you had, and the fabric will admit of that sort of thing.
Can you elaborate on the idea of song or singing?
Well, if you listen to the styles of ayahuasca singing, it can range over a pretty broad range. It can range from something which sounds pretty much like a takeoff of the Gyaltso monks, that very deep diaphragmatic vibration, to fairly lyrical thing. Not quite, you can't quite dance to it, but I think it's basically that you surrender, and then the song comes through, and the quality of the song resides in the moment. What's always puzzled me is how these people retain these songs, because once one comes through, they never seem to be lost. There may be meter in the song that I'm not aware of that makes it mnemonically easy to keep track of. But I've heard incredible singing, and sometimes the singing is acknowledged to be incredible. I was in an ayahuasca circle once, and songs were sung, and this guy was there who nobody really knew, and he sang a song so amazing that the curing stopped, everything stopped, and the shaman just sat down across from this guy and said, "Teach me this song. We're not leaving till I learn this song." And they sat there till 6:30 in the morning, and he did learn the song, and it was incredible. I mean, even down, it seemed psychedelic. It seemed impossible. The liquid gliding, the strange language with these glottal stops, and then these liquid glissandos. It was impossible to imitate. That's why it took even the shaman hours to commit it.
The ayahuasca, the composition?
It depends on the area of the Amazon, but it is usually either Psychotria viridis, which is a small bush in the Rubiaceae related to coffee, or it's a near relative of Banisteriopsis caapi in the nearby genus Diploteris cabrerana. For some reason, all the genes that produce harmine in the other Banisteriopsis leonis produce DMT in that one. So it's the interplay between these two that controls the visions. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned the Torah a couple times this morning. I was wondering if thought of the effects of that, and if you had any things about administration or preparation or experience.
Well, remember, I said this morning my interests are pretty tightly focused on this tryptamine thing. There are many, many altered states that are possible, and the datura is one of them that's plant-based, that's been traditionally utilized for magical purposes, but that doesn't seem to me very psychedelic. I also think you have to have a certain kind of personality to handle it. My experiments with it were not very happy, and the people around me who were experimenting with it were really getting out there. When I finally decided to put it behind me was when all this was going on in Nepal many years ago. And one day I was down in the market buying potatoes, and I met a friend of mine who also lived in the village, and he had been experimenting with Datura for many days. And in the course of our conversation, it came out that he thought we were in his apartment. And then I knew that, he had a serious breach with reality. I took Datura metal, Himalayan Datura seeds, in my upper rooms at Bodhanath in the Kathmandu Valley, and I found it very hard to engage with in the way I like to engage with these things. You would sit there and nothing seemed to be happening, and then your mind would drift off into a kind of twilight. And then there were these strange, wraith-like beings, almost like cartoon ghosts is what they were like. And they were coming in through my window, each one bearing an open sheet of newsprint. And these ghostly pages of newsprint would settle in my lap, and I would be sort of bent forward like this, and I would begin reading these stories in this ectoplasmic media, and then I would snap out of it and say, what was that? Nothing's happening. It's not working. Nothing's happening. And it was very elusive and mercurial. And then later there were very complicated muscle contortions, and I would find myself with my leg thrown up over my neck and this sort of thing, and I would very carefully untangle myself and lay back down, and then it would happen again. And I was thinking, I'm glad this is happening to me, and I'm glad nobody is here, because I'm sure this must look pretty alarming, and it probably is. It's a strange, ghostly thing where minds and realities seem to get all mixed up. I remember I had a New Zealander living down the hall from me in this Nepali rooming house, and at one point I had to go from my room through his room to get to the John, and in the middle of the night, and I glanced at his bed as I went through, and he was very clearly in the act of making love with a woman that I vaguely knew just from seeing in the marketplace. And the next morning, I mentioned it to him, and he said yes. He thought she was there too, but she wasn't there. Not for him and not for me. So, it was like it was inside somebody else's hallucination. Epistemic murk is a good phrase for those kinds of states of mind, and I don't like them because I can't sort it out. I don't like these watery, entangling.
Exposure to DMT came full circle again. Well, not quite full circle.
Well, see, it wasn't my Catholicism that it took from me. I abandoned my Catholicism over 5 or 6 years, jettisoning each piece slowly, and managed to transform myself into Jean Genet worshipping, existential, dark, anarcho-type character. An atheist, yes. And that's what it took from me in the 15-second interval.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
You came back to deity.
I came back to deity, but I don't think I came back to the Trinity. The Trinity and all other hypostatizations of deity that we inherit in major religions are such friendly, cheerful, cartoonish stuff compared to, the abyss of DMT. I'm not sure. I didn't exactly come back to deity. I came back to mystery. I immediately understood the relativity of the program of science, which had been my hope,
It's not a somebody out there, necessarily. It's more of a something or a what?
You can't tell because we cast such a large shadow on what we're looking at. In other words, if information begins to unfold in your head suddenly, new stuff that you've never thought, so quickly that you have to go, If I were to ask you then, what's happening? You would have to say, I'm having a conversation. That's because the only thing you know to call a situation where you're being given new information that fast is a conversation. But maybe this isn't a conversation. Maybe this is accelerated learning that appears to be happening so fast that it's like a conversation. I also notice in myself a weird thing, which is the longer it's been since I've taken something, the more conservative my position will be. I mean, if you catch me 9 hours after I've been there, I will take the positions that I've mostly abandoned, the most radical and crazed positions, the extraterrestrial intervention position, all of that. I keep trying to humanize it and to shrink its dimensions. But the fact of the matter is, up against it, it's weirder than I say it is. So, I don't know exactly what to do with that. The mind cannot encompass this thing. I'm convinced. It's like you pour the water of description over it, and it beads up and runs off. And so sometimes we're emphasizing one part, sometimes another. It seems to me it's just the limit case of understanding, and that maybe that's what it exists for, to demonstrate to human beings that there is a limit case for understanding. For me, as a language person and an analytical rationalist and so forth and so on, it's just such an amazing experience to stand in the presence of the unspeakable and to see it. And to say, you are unspeakable. You are not the white light. You're not the unitary anything. You are the unspeakable. And I can only encounter you in silence. But in silence, I encounter you 100%. And I just didn't think this kind of stuff was psychically lawful. I mean, I guess it isn't psychically lawful. That's the crux of the matter, isn't it?
So then how do you encounter that the further away from the experience you get then, like in your real life and out there in the world?
Well, you create metaphors. You tell yourself little stories. You create a new paradigm, is what it is. You replace scientific rationalism with psychedelic Zen synchronicity or some other way of describing it. But there is a way to make bridges out of it, remembering the relativity of everything. I mean, it really seems to be a relativistic kind of perception.
The mystery, which isn't necessarily good or bad, or benevolent or evil, but
it has a lot to do with the angle of regarding of what is shown to you. A lot of people who take mushrooms report some version of an end of the world revelation. Either we're all going to be lifted off in ships the size of Manitoba, or the Maitreya is just around the corner. But this unraveling apocalyptic scenario, and then the clinical view of that is that it's paranoia. But really, it's the archetype of our civilization. We have built into our civilization this dream of the end. And every war that comes along is hailed as the War of Armageddon. Every tin-horn dictator is hailed as the Antichrist. This has been going on for 500 years. If it's more specific than that, where you actually begin to pull apart, if it's really personalistically paranoid, then you're in my league. And I don't think there's any hope for you. I mean, you just have to really learn. I mean, the way I've fought it is by disbelieving anything, because my life is fairly science fiction-y and carries over it this question, which I grapple with all the time, which is, who do you work for? What is going on here? Do you understand what you're doing? And if you don't, who does? And why did they set you marching? Because I can tell what's happening here. We're trying to tinker with something. It's a groping in the dark for a button. We're trying to make something happen by saying words, by setting examples, by empowering people to do certain things. This is the mushrooms program, not mine. I mean, left to myself, I would probably be a hermit. And I'm much too cynical for crusades. But the mushroom isn't. The mushroom is a gung-ho kind of guy, and has this whole vision of man and fungus hand in hand to the stars. And I just say, you just meet the damnedest people out in the fields, and this is one of them.